Were you a SEAL too? The voice cut through the honor ceremony loud enough for everyone to hear. Then what was your call sign? A brief pause. Or do men like you not have one at all? A few scattered laughs broke out, then spread quickly. No one spoke up to stop them. Admiral Richard Hale smiled as if he had just told an innocent joke, a joke timed perfectly, a joke sharp enough to diminish a man. Ethan Morrow stood at the back of the hall. He wasn't wearing a uniform, no insignia, no medals. He didn't respond. He simply stared straight ahead. His hand rested gently on the shoulder of his daughter Lily, a reflex etched into him long ago. The laughter began to fade. The silence started to make some people uneasy. Because there are men who don't need to explain who they are, and there are questions that once asked in front of a crowd can never be taken back. If you believe that true courage isn't found in gunfire but in the silence of those who have lived through war. Subscribe to Service Honor Stories so together we can preserve the memory, dignity, and respect owed to our heroes. Ethan didn't walk away, and he didn't react in the way the crowd was expecting. There was no rebuttal, no irritated shrug, not even a strained smile to soften the moment. He stood still, as if the question hadn't been aimed at him at all yet. Everyone in the hall knew it had struck exactly where it was meant to. The silence stretched longer than what felt normal. No one could count how many breaths passed, only that the laughter from moments ago vanished too quickly, leaving behind an uncomfortable void hanging among people dressed in crisp military uniforms. A few began to turn their faces away, not out of respect but because they no longer knew where to look. Lily felt the change before she fully understood what was happening. Her father's hand was still on her shoulder, but the pressure eased, then tightened again, slowly, deliberately. His breathing deepened, more even, like an old reflex being awakened. She whispered softly, just loud enough for the two of them to hear, "Dad, should we go?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't bend down. He didn't turn his head. He simply shook it slightly. Not the shake of a man who had been wounded, but the shake of a man who had already made his decision. The silence continued. It wasn't loud, but it forced people to confront themselves. A young officer cleared his throat as if to break the tension. No one followed. In the middle row, an older man, gray at the temples, back straight, narrowed his eyes and watched Ethan longer than politeness required. He didn't smile. He didn't look uncomfortable. He was observing, not to judge status, but to recognize something familiar. The way Ethan stood, the way he kept distance from the crowd, the way his eyes never searched for approval. That wasn't the stance of a man out of place. It was the stance of someone who had stood alone in places far harsher than this. Another service member leaned over and whispered, "He's not an ordinary man." The one beside him didn't reply. He only gave a slight nod. In that moment, the silence began to change shape. It was no longer the awkward gap left by an overreaching joke. It became an unanswered question, and that question made some people uneasy. Because if Ethan were truly just an ordinary father, why didn't he defend himself? And if he didn't need to defend himself, what then stood behind that silence? Admiral Richard Hale sensed the shift faster than the others. The smile on his face didn't disappear, but it stiffened. He wasn't used to being ignored, and he was even less accustomed to having his authority suspended in midair with no one reaching to claim it. He was about to say something else. Then he stopped, because he realized this. With every second Ethan remained silent, the balance in that room tipped a little further, not toward him, but toward the man standing quietly at the back of the hall. Ethan remained there. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't project importance. Yet his silence carried something the crowd hadn't expected: weight. Not the weight of rank, not the weight of medals, but the weight of things left unsaid, things that exist only in the memories of those who had been somewhere not everyone comes back from. And in that moment, some people finally understood. This silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint. And it was the moment when the question that had seemed harmless only minutes earlier began to turn into a mistake that could never be taken back. Admiral Richard Hale didn't back down. He was accustomed to pushing the boundary just a little further enough to turn another person's silence into entertainment for the crowd. "Well then," Hale said lightly, as if joking, "maybe you worked in logistics." A brief pause, just long enough for a few smiles to appear. Or the kitchen. Those positions rarely come with call signs. A few laughs broke out, not loud, but clear enough. A young officer tilted his head and added, "That's right, everyone plays a part." The remark sounded harmless, but it struck exactly where it hurt. Not because of its content, but because of the setting. Lily felt her face grow warm. She didn't need to look around to know eyes were fixed on her father. Not curious eyes, measuring ones watching to see how he would react when cornered. She lowered her head, her hands clenched together. She wanted to say something, to pull her father away, to turn this moment into a misunderstanding that could be forgotten. But Ethan didn't move. He kept his posture unchanged, not straighter to appear defiant, not lower to retreat. He stood the way a man stands when he knows he has nothing to prove. Hale stared at him waiting. He was used to people reacting, arguing back, or apologizing. But Ethan gave him neither. The silence became a mirror, and in that mirror the joke began to reveal its true shape. Another young officer laughed again, shorter this time, sharper. "He's taking this way too seriously." No one answered. In the back row, an older man leaned slightly toward the person beside him. His voice was low, almost dissolving into the air. "No, that man isn't ordinary." The man next to him turned his head slightly. He didn't ask a question. He simply looked at Ethan longer. The way Ethan kept his distance from the crowd, the way he didn't seek support, the way he didn't need anyone to step in and defend him. That wasn't the reflex of someone being pressured. It was the reflex of someone who had endured weight far heavier than cheap jokes. Hale felt it, even if he didn't want to admit it. His voice stiffened, still trying to sound amused. "Don't misunderstand. We honor every contribution here." Ethan didn't reply. It was a sentence that should have ended everything. But Ethan's silence left it suspended, never allowed to land. The crowd began to shift. No one stepped forward. No one laughed again. A few people turned away as if they didn't want to be remembered as having laughed along. Lily looked up at her father. What she saw wasn't embarrassment. It was focus. Cold, deep focus, like that of someone who realizes he is being tested. She whispered, barely audible, "Dad." Ethan tightened his grip slightly on her shoulder without turning around. The squeeze was brief and firm. A familiar signal, "Stay calm." Hale cleared his throat, sensing the air slipping out of his control. He was about to say something more, not to apologize, but to reclaim authority. But before he could speak, several gazes were no longer on him. They were fixed on Ethan, not out of curiosity, but because people were beginning to understand there are men who, when publicly humiliated, do not strike back with words. They let silence do the work for them. And at that very moment, the joke from earlier was no longer harmless. It became a marker of public humiliation, not for the man who was questioned, but for the one who asked the question. And in that instant, as the final traces of laughter disappeared, those watching began to realize that what was unfolding had moved beyond the reach of any careless joke, and into a different phase, one where the truth would no longer remain silent. The atmosphere in this hall changed in a way no one openly acknowledged, yet everyone felt it. It didn't come from a new remark. It came from the absence of laughter. The laughs from moments ago, once used to mask discomfort, now had nowhere to cling. They dissolved, leaving behind a silence unlike the one before. This silence wasn't awkward. It had direction. In the middle row, Commander James Vale was no longer looking at Admiral Hale. His gaze settled on the man standing at the back of the room, Ethan Morrow, longer than politeness allowed. Vale wasn't watching like a spectator. He was watching like a commander. He recognized that stance instantly. Not relaxed, not performative. The center of gravity lowered just enough to react if needed, yet never to draw attention. Ethan's eyes didn't sweep the room looking for an exit. They didn't lock onto the man who had insulted him either. They rested at a midpoint, the place of someone trained to observe an entire space without turning his head. Vale swallowed. He had seen that look in places no one wanted to remember. Not the look of an ordinary father, but the look of someone trained to stand firm when everything around him collapses. A very small movement from Ethan caught Vale's eye. Not a step, not a reaction, just the slightest adjustment of the shoulder, as if the body were automatically returning to a familiar state. Vale tilted his head and spoke very softly to the man beside him. "Do you see it?" The other man didn't answer right away. He followed Vale's gaze, then nodded. Attention began to spread, quietly, without any obvious signal. But one by one, eyes drifted away from Admiral Hale. Not out of disrespect, but because questions were forming questions no one dared to ask aloud. If Ethan were merely an ordinary father, why wasn't he afraid if he were just an anonymous guest? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did his silence unsettle men who had once worn rank? Why did Vale took a deep breath as if reconnecting with an old memory. He remembered pre-mission briefings where the most dangerous men were always the quietest ones, men who didn't need to assert themselves, because when they spoke it usually meant things had already gone too far. At the front, Hale still wore his diplomatic smile, but Vale could see it clearly now it was no longer natural. The Admiral began to shift his weight, not with words, but with impatience. He was used to having the attention on him, used to having the story revolve around him, and now that authority was slipping away without ceremony, without announcement. No one stood up to challenge Hale. No one had stepped in to defend Ethan either, and that was what made it frightening. Because in the culture of those who have served, recognition rarely comes through words. It comes through attention, and at this moment, that attention had changed direction. Vale said nothing more. He simply straightened slightly. A very small movement, but enough for a few others to notice. The silence in the hall was no longer an empty gap. It had become a compressed zone, a space where those who once understood orders began to wonder which invisible command was now being activated. Ethan remained still, unaware, or fully aware. He didn't seek Vale's gaze. He didn't need to. Men like him don't require others to validate their existence. They need only a moment for the truth to rise on its own from the depths of collective memory. And as power began to drift away from the one who had insulted him before anyone spoke it aloud, everyone understood. This would not end with a careless joke. It was merely waiting for a single concise sentence not to strike back, but to throw open a door to something no one in that hall would be able to ignore any longer. Admiral Richard Hale was no longer smiling. He took half a step forward, his voice lowered, but still clear enough for everyone to hear. "I asked you." A brief pause. "What is your call sign?" This was no joke. There was no way back. It was the final act of pressure. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked down at Lily. Not for long. Just long enough for her to understand that what was about to happen was no longer only about him. He whispered very softly, "I'm sorry." Lily opened her mouth to say something, then stopped. She realized her father's voice had changed. Not trembling, not hesitant, but the voice of someone who had already accepted the consequences before speaking. Ethan raised his head. He didn't look around, he didn't seek support. His gaze settled directly on Hale, neither defiant nor evasive. He spoke slowly, each word clearly separated Damascus. A very brief pause. "Did not unfold the way your report says." No one laughed. No one coughed. No one moved. The sentence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Yet it dropped into the hall like a heavy object, freezing everything in place. A young officer blinked repeatedly as if he had misheard. Another unconsciously exhaled sharply. Hale froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough to reveal his true reflex. Then he immediately changed his tone. "What are you talking about?" Hale replied quickly, his voice slightly higher than before. Damascus was a fully documented operation. Ethan didn't interrupt. Hale continued faster now, more defensive. "Perhaps you're mistaken. The records have been confirmed." Ethan tilted his head slightly, not in doubt, but like someone who had heard this answer far too many times. He said, "I was there." 3 words, no more, no explanation. No one spoke. Hale took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Who are you to say this?" Ethan answered immediately without hesitation. "I'm the one who carried my teammates out of there." Another beat of silence. Not long, but long enough for several people in the hall to realize that a line had just been crossed. Hale pressed his lips together, his eyes darting for the first time during the ceremony. He spoke again, his voice changed. "This is not the place to discuss sensitive matters." Ethan nodded. "Correct." Then he added, "But you asked." Hale opened his mouth to argue, then stopped, because now it wasn't only Ethan looking at him. Several faces in the hall had changed completely, no longer curious, but aware that the original question, once thought harmless, had opened a door that could never be closed again. Lily tightened her grip on her father's sleeve. She didn't fully understand what Damascus was, but she understood one thing. Her father had just crossed a boundary no one could pull him back from. Ethan remained where he was. He didn't step forward. He didn't step back. He didn't demand recognition. He didn't ask for an apology. He He simply placed the truth in the middle of the hall and let everyone decide for themselves what they would do with it. Hale spoke more slowly now, each word heavy. "We'll discuss this later," Ethan replied, "if you want." Then he fell silent. This silence was different from before. It was no longer restraint. It was an invitation for things long hidden to begin stepping into the light on their own. And in that very moment when no one could pretend anymore that this was just a misunderstanding, the silent evidence buried alongside memory prepared to speak on behalf of those who no longer had the chance to tell the truth themselves. Ethan didn't say more than what was necessary. He understood that in this moment the more he explained, the more the truth would be diluted. He spoke only of the things that only those who were there could know. The sound of the first RPG. Ethan said, his voice steady and low. It didn't explode right away. It struck the wall, then ricocheted. A few people in the hall shuddered slightly, not because of the words themselves, but because of their precision. Ethan continued. The extraction point was compromised 10 minutes earlier. He paused for a brief beat, not due to a tactical error. No one interrupted. Those sentences carried no emotion. They were like timestamps carved into memory, impossible to erase, impossible to rewrite. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, not hurried, not performative. He took out a small object and placed it on his open palm. A Damascus coin. It wasn't shiny, not new. Its surface was worn by time and by hands that had once clenched it tightly in the dark. For a moment, no one understood its significance. Until Commander James Vale saw it. Vale froze. Not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. His eyes locked onto the coin, then shifted to Ethan, then back to the coin again. He took half a step forward, not speaking at first. His throat moved slightly. "That's impossible," Vale whispered. His voice was quiet, but loud enough for a few nearby to hear. Another officer standing slightly behind Hale went pale. He recognized the symbol etched along the rim of the coin. Not an official insignia, but an internal mark, one given only to those who were never meant to exist in the records. Ethan continued without looking at Vale. This coin wasn't given in a ceremony. It was given in silence. Vale took a deep breath. He knew it. Anyone who had been close enough to unreportable operations knew it. Hale opened his mouth to say something, but this time no one was waiting for him. Attention had left him at some point unnoticed. Ethan rotated the coin slightly in his hand. A thin scratch surfaced on its face. He said, "That mark was made when we pulled the last man out of the collapsed building. 3 of them didn't make it back." A silence fell over the hall, not a tense silence, but the silence of realization. Vale spoke again, clearer this time. That symbol was given to only one group. Ethan nodded, and that group had no name. Hale shook his head, his voice urgent. "This is not evidence." Ethan looked directly at him for the first time since taking out the coin. "That's true." Then he added, "But you know what it is?" Hale fell silent. A young officer murmured, "My God." No one faulted him for saying it, because at this point the truth no longer needed to be argued. It was present, not through accusation, not through paperwork, but through a small object carrying the memories of those who were no longer here to speak for themselves. Ethan slipped the coin back into his pocket, not to hide it, but because he had finished his part. He didn't look around to gauge reactions. He didn't wait for validation. He understood that from this moment on, the truth had found its own path forward. Those who recognized it would never forget. Those who didn't would eventually be forced to face it. And precisely when that silent symbol had spoken on behalf of those who no longer had a voice power in the hall, began to shift openly, no longer a vague sensation, but an undeniable reversal that could not be denied. "You're fabricating this, Admiral," Richard Hale snapped, his voice sharp and rigid. "You have no authority to stand here and rewrite history." Silence answered him. No longer the silence of surprise, but the silence of people listening for what would come next. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The withdrawal order was given, he said clearly. A clean order, and I refused it. Hale let out a dry laugh. "So you admit to disobeying orders?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." A few people in the hall held their breath. Hale seized the moment, then to save the hostages. Ethan continued cutting him off. 3 children, We knew the extraction point was compromised. We knew that pulling out then meant leaving them to die. Hale shook his head, his voice urgent. There's no evidence the official records distorted the truth, Ethan said. Not to protect the soldiers, but to protect decisions made at the command level. Hale's face flushed. You're slandering us. Ethan replied, no, you're denying it. A pause. Brief, but long enough for those who understood to see the opening. Commander James Vale stepped forward one pace. He didn't look at Hale. He looked at Ethan. You refuse to withdraw, Vale said slowly, as if confirming each word. Because there were hostages. Yes, Ethan answered. And because we were led into a kill zone. Vale gave a slight nod. He spoke in a low voice. Those details aren't in the report. Hale turned toward Vale Commander. Vale raised his hand. Not high, just enough to stop the words. That report, Vale said, has been questioned for a long time. A murmur spread through the room, no longer a whisper, but a belated acknowledgement. Hale looked around, searching for supportive eyes. He found none. Ethan continued, keeping his pace steady. 3 of our men didn't come back. The record says they died for disobedience. The truth is, they died covering the hostages' withdrawal. Hale slammed his hand down beside the chair. Stop. Vale turned to face Ethan. He stood straight. Then in front of the crowd he raised his hand in salute. A crisp motion, precise, needing no explanation. The hall froze. Ethan didn't return it immediately, not out of surprise, but because he understood the weight of the moment. Then he saluted back. Clean. Exact. As if he had never stepped away from it. Another officer followed, then another. Arms rose not in unison but in agreement. No command was given, no signal exchanged. Power left the place it was assumed to belong and shifted through recognition. Hale stood rigid, his eyes swept across the salutes, his jaw tightened. He had no choice left. Hale raised his hand in return, slowly, heavily, not out of respect, but because he could not avoid it. Ethan met his gaze. No mockery, no sense of victory. He lowered his hand first, as if closing a chapter he had never wanted to open in public. Lily stood close beside him. She didn't understand every rank, but she understood what had just happened. It wasn't that her father had been honored. It was that the truth had been restored to its rightful place. Vale spoke loud enough for the hall to hear. There are records that need to be reopened. No one objected. Hale turned away. No one saw him off. Ethan remained still for one more beat. Then he turned to his daughter, placed his hand on her shoulder just as at the beginning, as if everything had come full circle back to what mattered most. And when power had finally shifted through a salute that could not be taken back, what lay ahead was no longer confrontation, but consequence, memory, and the restoration of honor to those who could no longer stand and speak their final truth. The investigation was reopened in silence. There were no loud press conferences, no public apologies, only old files pulled from steel cabinets one page at a time under the stern gaze of those who understood exactly what it meant to reopen them. Richard Hale's name slowly disappeared from honor briefings, then from speaker lists, then from every position that had once placed him above others. No one said he had fallen. But everyone knew that a career built on the distortion of truth cannot stand when the truth returns. Ethan did not appear at any announcement. He declined every interview request. He signed nothing that resembled public recognition. When an officer came to him and said, "People want to restore your honor," Ethan simply shook his head. "Honor isn't something that can be given back," he said. "It can only be lived correctly." He placed his hand on Lily's shoulder the way he always did when he wanted to end a conversation. Lily no longer asked many questions. She understood now. She understood why her father chose to stand at the back of the hall, why he avoided ceremonies, why silence to him was not avoidance but protection. "Weren't you afraid they'd forget you?" she once asked. Ethan had answered quietly, "Those who need to remember already do." Their family returned to their old life. Morning still began with small routines, short sentences, familiar silences, but something had changed. Ethan no longer lowered his head when passing military photographs displayed in public spaces, not out of pride, but because he no longer needed to avoid his own reflection. Lily walked beside her father with her back a little straighter, not because of his reputation, but but because she understood that some people spend their entire lives protecting things no one sees, and that is precisely what makes them worthy of holding their heads high. One day Lily said calmly, "I understand now. Why you stayed silent all those years." Ethan didn't ask her to explain. He knew exactly what she meant. She continued, "Not because you had nothing to say, but because if the truth is spoken too early, it gets used as something to trade." Ethan nodded. Out there, a few names were restored. A few lines and reports were corrected. A few families finally received the answers they had waited far too long for. There were no dramatic reunions, only quiet nods, short letters, words of thanks that required no reply. Ethan read them alone, then put them away, not to forget, but to keep living. Because for him, the past was not a place to remain. It was a place to understand why he chose this path, a path of silence but never of weakness. And if anything was left behind after all that had happened, it wasn't a corrected file. It wasn't a collapsed career. It was a simple reminder for anyone who ever believed power allowed them to mock others. Honor doesn't need to be spoken loudly until someone tries to laugh at it. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please share this video and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Service Honor Stories. We remember the quiet heroes,